Thank you for tuning into Student Power Radio. My name's Steven, and I'm joined here today with our co-host, Star, Mikey, and Seba. Today we'll be dissecting the nature of abolition and what that means to incoming VCU students. Our first question is we're just going to open it up and talk a little bit about what does care look like, and what does care look like for you individually, and what does care look like for communities.
I definitely think in terms of care, we have to, along with this movement, we have to do a complete revamp of what care is and what care means to us. Because I think the institutions that we have now obviously are not willing to and are completely unable to care for individuals, for communities, environment, pretty much anything, when their founding principles are founded pretty much in criminalization. So when we think about care, I think there's two parts to it, what care looks like in the community, but what care means to us. So yeah, I just want to open it up for you guys. I guess we can start off by, asking each other what care means to us, because for listeners, I really want this to be a conversation that maybe, you all can have with your friends and have with your family members or anyone, because these conversations, in order for this movement to keep going, we're going to have these tough conversations. So yeah, I'll start out by, do you guys want to talk a little bit about what care looks like for you?
For me, I think it comes in a lot of forms. I think personally, I know it's a buzzword, but self-care is so important, especially in times like right now. There's so much going on. I know for each and every one of us, we're all busy, all that stuff. I think it's really important to take that time for yourself, because if you're not being able to take care of yourself, nobody will. Mm-hmm. And I think in order to be able to give back to the people you care about, you got to make sure house and home is taken care of first. Right. So I think with that, I think there's a bunch of different aspects, but I think number one, making sure your personal is being taken care of. And then in terms of communities of care, I think it's really important that we establish them, because individually making sure that we're good, we have to have those support systems. We have to create those communities. And it doesn't just mean making sure that we're okay mentally. It means fiscally. It means that people who can provide, we're okay, we got you. It means taking care of you mentally, like I said, making sure that everyone is on the same page about their lives, making sure that we're good. Because at the end of the day, for us to sustain communities, you have to be there for your comrades. Right. So I think those two metrics, and then also just generally establishing a system that communities can thrive under is really important when we're talking about care. I think us having those difficult discussions, you always say, and I know it's an Audre Lorde quote, right? Yeah, self-care is a radical act. I think on a communal scale, we have to emphasize that. That means challenging ideals of white supremacy. That means educating others. That means having those deep and intellectual discussions with your comrades about things that perhaps you don't agree on. So I think all of those are forms of care, and I think care comes at a premium right now. And I think the only way to not make it a premium is if we emphasize it and really hone in on what's important when it comes to taking care of yourself and your community.
I think for me too, care is what makes me feel safe, and also what respects the boundaries that I have as well. I think that's something that we, a lot of times when we talk about respecting boundaries, we usually address it in terms of other people, interpersonal relationships with other people, but it's also respecting your own boundaries that you have as well. Care looks different, I think, for everybody. For me, care is ensuring that I am doing the best that I can be at the moment that I am. Being able to live my optimum potential with the capability and support of not only my own self, but the community as well, and ensuring that I have the capability to do what I need to do at the end of the day. I think, especially in terms of marginalized groups, it's really an important conversation. It's a necessary conversation we need to be having, because disenfranchised groups don't necessarily always have those systems of care that are established by external forces. A lot of times we rely on our community members, we rely on our family. Some of us don't have anybody to rely on in terms of where to find that support and where to find that care. I think it's really a necessary conversation to have, because at the end of the day, care is so necessary in terms of sustaining your mental health, sustaining your physical health, sustaining your emotional health, and also sustaining the relationships you have with other people. Those require a great deal of care as well. Those are deliberate relationships that you likely have, and they're going to require some form of routine care to ensure that they're optimal. And if you can't ensure that you're retaining your optimal capability, then it's going to be very difficult for you to translate out. And so I think when we talk about these, it seems almost rudimentary. A lot of people are like, what's care? Like, what is care to me? Like, I know what self-care is. Self-care is this, self-care is that. But I think care is it's just a continuous act. It's essential. You live, breathe, and eat, but you also care, and you also are providing for yourself daily. It's when you're saying, Audre Lorde's quote that care, I think, is it revolutionary or radical act? I think it's
radical act. Yeah.
Radical act. Yeah. It's a radical act. I think it's a radical act because, oftentimes we're put in positions where our care and our concern and our importance isn't prioritized by
right. Especially living in like a imperialist capitalist system. This system deliberately creates condition wherein you cannot take care of yourself, you cannot take care of your community, and you're forced to really betray your boundaries. So yeah, exactly, right.
Yeah, and to me, I feel like care, like whenever I think about it, like before I would think about it in like this bubble where it's like that self-care. But looking at it now, it's self-care isn't enough. We need community care to thrive. And I feel like that would come in terms of getting to know your neighbors, getting to know the people around you. And when they are in need, that you're there for them, and having that mutual support is so important, because at the end of the day, those are the people that are going to look after you as well. So it's building those connections, getting to know who you're talking to daily, and making sure that when certain community demands are in need to be uplifted, that we are there and we're in support and showing solidarity. Right. And I feel like that is all part of care and all part of healing. That is how we build a very strong community and can move forward to a world that we want to live in, and a world that we're fighting for. I think it's really important that to have these conversations and about care and what that would look like for you. And when I look at Care Born Deathly, I see that envision these crisis centers where someone is going through a mental health crisis, they can get help from a mental health professional. When certain communities might not have access to education like other affluent communities might, when I look at it in the future, it's that equal amount of education that everyone can get access to. And looking at it more deeply, having those trauma centers for young people, having that support system. So seeing these type of systems in place when we move forward, when we're talking about care.
Right. I think definitely for me, in terms of care, is something that in the last year or two of my life that I've really centered and really emphasized as something that is of the utmost importance for me. I know that in past podcasts, I have talked about the ways I've betrayed myself and not honored my boundaries. And that's something that I definitely get caught up in so much, especially like with that overarching feeling of imposter syndrome. You feel like you have to perform and show up to the fullest extent all the time. For us, it's really important to recenter ourselves and really listen to what our bodies are telling us. I tell people that all the time, when you're trying to make a decision or you feel a certain way, what is your body trying to tell you? What is the root of that emotion? And sit in that. Don't push that down. Don't sweep it under the rug. Really sit in that emotion and get into the root of what's going on, because your body will tell you a lot. Being connected to your community and watching out for your friends, for your comrades, for your neighbors, when checking in and making sure that the space, if you have the capacity to do so, but they have the space to really decompress and kind of let go with you, I think is super, super important, because all of us have a duty to ourselves, but also to our community to take care of ourselves and take care of each other. So yeah, like somebody you were saying, especially with mental health, it is so important to have access to care, not just within yourself, but maybe in your neighbors, but also, like mental health crisis centers, informed counselors that are going to be able to help you in your time of need. So yeah, I definitely think within ourselves, really taking the time to listen, honor our boundaries, and also too knowing what is for you and what is not. If negative energy is directed your way, consider the source. Is this information pertinent to me? Is this information really a projection of what someone else is feeling? Is this true? I mean, you know yourself best. I say that all the time. You know your body, you know yourself. And it's so important to honor what your body, what your mind, and what you know. I mean, you live in this body for your entire life. You know what's going on. So really honoring that for me has been super important. So yeah.
Yeah, I also think it's like acknowledging the room for personal and self growth.
Yeah.
I think we talk about all the time that like these ideals that we preach, and I think it's important to note that like it takes work to do that. It takes work to see institutionalized racism. It takes work to see like how all that stuff interplays with you. And I think taking care of yourself and like part of that is like recognizing that self growth.
Because growth is, I know everybody says it all the time, but growth is not a linear process. And within even my own mental health journey, I've gotten so frustrated with myself in that I always think, am I going to be this way for the rest of my life? Like, am I going to have these pits of depression, anxiety, these pits where, I don't even want to live in this world for the rest of my life? But now I see that I'm committed to healing, because healing is a lifelong journey. And, when people kind of get that, oh, we'll just get over it. Yeah. Well, no, this is something that you have to work on and be deliberate and intentional about forever. Yeah. It doesn't just stop when you're young. It doesn't stop, when you've gone through something difficult. There are always going to be times that we have to create the space to improve, to heal, and also to hear out, the people around us and what they need in terms of care. I think being intentional about listening to yourself, but also listening to those around you. Center the voices of those that need the care and really listen to what they need.
I feel, and that's why like it's so important to cultivate that like sense of self-care. It's so important to cultivate that, because it's like it pays itself forward over time. Like you're talking about with growth, like you go through like this growth process where you learn a lot about yourself. You really learn how to take care of yourself. And the reason why it's so important, and I always emphasize like it starts at house and home, is because it's like in order to take care of yourself, you have to go through that process. And then once you realize you're there, where you're able to help somebody else, you can help instill those values into them. I think that's like how we can start community building and like talking about how like we build these community cares, because I think individually there's so much work that has to be done before you can go ahead and help anyone else.
Right.
So kind of segueing into that, I guess the larger question was, we're talking a lot about care individually, but we've also kind of talked about ways that community care is facilitated and how it operates. And so how can communities keep each other safe, and how can communities have care for one another and kind of build those relationships and establish those systems of support?
I think in terms of keeping each other safe, it's like what I said earlier about there's so many metrics. I think fiscally it's so important, because it's like we talk about evictions all the time happening in Richmond. Like evictions are violent. Making sure people aren't getting evicted on a monthly basis is so important. I think that's a community of care. Making sure that mentally we're all being taken care of, everyone's well-being is being supported, people are able to live their truth and freedom. I think that's taking care of yourself and your community. I think it also leaves room for interpretation. I think we're creating a radical space, and I think it's important to include everyone's experience. I think the great thing about creating these communities is that we're not really bound by traditional ideals of self-care. I think everyone's experience is validated, and I think that's really important. So I think it's more kind of enough for interpretation type thing. And that's at least my own personal perspective. I think in terms of keeping each other safe, it's realizing that the validity of everyone's struggles. I think it's important to support them while they're going through those struggles. I think that's all part of the interpretive experience of community building when it comes to self-care.
Yeah, I definitely think that it definitely is up for interpretation. I think another piece that goes along with it, though, is knowing your community. What's really frustrating about so many of these like public officials or people who come and try to do better is that they don't know the community. They don't know what the community needs. They don't know what the community is really plagued with and struggling with. So if you don't know, the stories and narratives of those most affected, how can you care for it? And so I think when we think about keeping each other safe and really going into that, it's really getting to know who your neighbors are, go out into the community, meet people, especially for VCU students, meet people who are not VCU students. And Kalia touched on this in one of our last podcasts, but really immersing yourself into this community, because as students, we live in Richmond, we do a whole bunch of things in Richmond. So it's really important to connect yourself with the community and then look out for each other, really understanding that piece of how can we keep each other safe, and what do members of the community need to feel safe? That's like a big question that all of us have to do that work inside ourselves, but also, again, having those difficult conversations. What do you need to feel safe? What does safety look like for you? I think is super important.
I agree. I think kind of you guys talked generally about like the thematics of that too, but I think a little bit more specifically, like mutual aid is one way that communities can keep each other safe. Mutual aid operates on the basis and understanding that resources can be allocated and distributed to those most affected and those needed. I feel like that in Richmond especially, we have a large system of that going on right now, and it's been amazing to see the work that mutual aid, especially Matt RVA, mutual aid Richmond, has been doing work in terms of that. Other organizations have been doing things about redistributing furniture or clothing or food to housing insecure individuals, Black communities and whatnot. And so I think that's another good way to look at keeping communities safe. And in terms of, let's say like mental health or just really any sort of thing that involves health and understanding inclusion, like inclusion training and that understanding and that sensitivity training to know how to address specific groups. Because I think a lot of times, especially at VCU, we talked with a faculty member who is attempting to try and like recultivate and decolonize the syllabus that professors are having for students so that it's more inclusive to Indigenous, queer, disabled, housing insecure, Black, brown students. In doing that, I think a lot of times VCU doesn't even want the necessity to have an inclusion statement, or doesn't really need professors to take these inclusivity and diversity training courses because they feel like it's a waste of resources, or it's not direct enough, or the causation is, the outcome is not necessarily feasible in terms of the causation. And so making sure that we're educating ourselves and having a continuous education, not only about just academia, but also the experiences that individuals have, and understanding that, because, when we do have mental health crises, there needs to be inclusivity training to be done beforehand to understand how different marginalized or different groups can, react to these situations.
So I guess my question posed to you guys is, what does this radical new world look like to y'all? Maybe keeping in terms of like everything going on, everything we're pushing for. What does this radical new world mean? How do y'all feel about it?
I feel good and positive about it, because I feel like at one of the most recent actions, we were asked, do you think abolition is doable in your lifetime, right? And I feel like we have no choice but to push our whole energy and weight behind it, because it has to be doable. That's how I feel. It has to be doable in my lifetime. And I genuinely believe that it is. And I think that when thinking about this radical new world, we really need to get to the root of all the issues plaguing our society, right? And a lot of times when we say defund, abolish the police, people say, well, what about crime? Right now, we have these policing structures that are very reactionary. They do nothing to eliminate the root of what causes crime. Poverty causes crime. Racism and white supremacy causes crime. Lack of education, accessible education, lack of accessible healthcare, lack of, resources and communities, that causes crime. So I think when we're imagining this radical new world, in my eyes, I want to build these institutions, these structures of care that really get to the root of those issues, so that the needs of the community are met in a way that crime isn't so appealing anymore.
I think it's important to note that like it's not conducive to demonize those who are being oppressed. I think it's important to note, like when in your like talking about your radical new world, you spoke on policing. I think it's important to note that like over the last, I'd say 50 to 60 years, we've allowed corporatization of the American ecosystem to kind of plague our communities. I think that it's important to note that for every Richmond, there's hundreds of Richmonds all across the country. I think that we have our own battles, but I also think it's important that every community is able to highlight their own struggles. I think in my radical new world, people won't have to have gate-kept education. People won't have to wait in excessive lines to get their personal products. I think that the only way to do that is to break down the corporative system. I'm not here saying my radical world isn't conducive to capitalism because I hate the spread of money and or free trade. I'm saying that because the current system we have is rooted in white supremacy. I think that the current system we have is rooted in oppression. So for me, like when it comes to like what my radical new world looks like, it is those communities of care. It's an emphasis on highlighting personal struggle. It's a emphasis on getting police out of the systems because oftentimes they're the demonizers and perpetrators of the crimes and violence going on in our communities. I think it's important to note that. I think it's also important to note that we take care of us in a substantially better ways than we're being taken care of now by institutions that are supposed to be taking care of us. You look at how our government institutions have kind of allowed bureaucracy and corporate interests and private interests and greed and self-indulgence to kind of to fill how the everyday person lives their life. And I think it's important to know that we don't have to live that way. I think in my radical new world, people are able to speak their truth and live their life in like a very fulfilling and open way. And I think that's really where I'm looking forward to in the future. And I do think, like you were saying, Star, it's very possible. And the only reason why I know it's possible is because we're doing it right now. And I think it's also, the last thing is like, it's important to note that for people, especially people in communities of color, like we have this innate trauma, and I think addressing that rather than sweeping it under the rug is part of my new radical future. You know, it's like having, like the future should not have to struggle with the same things that we did, and their children should not have to struggle with the same things they did. And I feel like right now our current system is just us repeating the same struggles of our parents.
I agree with that. Like having those systems of care again, like that's the new radical world that we're looking forward to. And I do have hope for it because we're doing the work now. Like people are out there fighting for the better world.
I think my only thing that I guess wouldn't necessarily be touched on by you guys is what does a radical new world look like? And I think it's actually the perfect timing because I was just reading an email that was sent out by VCU administration about kind of the VCU administration about other students now being able to police other students and send in reports and whatnot, and kind of talking with that in tandem. I think, what does a radical new world look like? It doesn't exist where just physical police are abolished. You know, a lot of times we talk about like the police officer in your head or, other people policing other people's actions. And I think allowing people to feel as though they can intuitively be themselves and apologetically themselves and be able to share and express their individuality and also who they are and represent their community, I think is really important in carving out a new world, is celebrating the differences that each of us have while also maintaining a degree of respect in terms of, what our position in specific issues.
And so piggybacking off of that, I guess when we're imagining this radical new world, we have to ask ourselves kind of the importance of all narratives being included and all needs of people being met. So what do you guys think the importance of including everyone's voice and narrative?
I think the reason why narrative collection, making sure everybody's voice is heard, is because for so long we've been lulled by the ideals of like democratization, saying that we live in a world where everyone is represented, and it's not true. I think it's really important to note that, especially as people of color, I know we talk about it all the time, that representation means everything. Like there's no representation, I feel, in terms of most, I guess, institutional standards and most governing bodies. I don't feel like like being able to see somebody that looks like me making decisions and speaking on behalf of people that looks like me is so important. So I think, like, just from like my own personal perspective, I think the reason why narratives should be collected is because representation means everything. I think everybody has a unique voice and perspective that offers nuance, and they should be able to speak their truth. But I think also, in terms of why they should be included, is because when we're building, like what we were talking about, like this radical new world, there's strength in numbers. Like, we all have these experiences, and it's the same, I guess, continual crop of people speak on the problems that we all have, and we don't use our voice as a collective good. All that work that they're doing is in vain, because it's so easy to blow off a couple of people like speaking their truth. But when everyone speaks their truth, we kind of become inevitable. So I think that's really important too. And also allowing like narratives to be shared allows, like I said, the nuance, but also like kind of doesn't allow any place for group speak. Like, I think that we're able to share our individualities and speak our truths consistently with each other, but like also while like creating a collaborative world. So I think in terms of like narrative sharing, I think everybody does have a place. And I think that's because in the world that we're trying to create, everyone does have a place as well.
Mm-hmm. You know, I think that's especially important. And also too, we want to build something different, right, from what we have now. And obviously what we have now is not, it does not adequately serve the people, but also it doesn't include the narratives from anyone else except for like rich, white, cis, het,
male.
Yeah. And sometimes female.
Sometimes female. Yeah.
Sometimes, yeah. So
white women, I'm looking at you.
Yeah,
no,
white women.
I'm just kidding.
But
I'm not.
But I think that in order to build something different, we really have to. We have to dig within ourselves, and also though listen to narratives that are completely different from our own, and be accountable for the ways that we have, you know, upheld white supremacy, but also done harm to communities that are different from our own. You know, so I definitely think, you know, there is a great importance of narrative sharing, and also just listening and amplifying the voices of those that are affected by these issues that we really want to tackle.
And kind of in tandem with that, and just talking about the necessity to have these narratives included too, I think it's also really important that while we are having these narratives included, it's also really essential to remember what our demands are. You know, we are here to abolish PD. We are here to abolish systems of white oppression, of systematic oppression. And so my question is, why abolition and not reformation? You know, why transformative justice and not reformative justice?
So with that, bias trainings and body cameras haven't stopped police from killing. These reforms do not work because police officers are working within a system that is racist. These systems are set up to perpetuate racist policies and approaches for centuries. And that systemic racism also carries throughout the entire criminal justice. We can't just talk about policing. We have to also talk about what happens in the courts and the corrections as well. And we need to start tackling the roots of it. And abolition is the only way to tackle these systems that were built to oppress Brown and Black people.
Right, because I think, like, you know, real touching on is that these systems were deliberately created to oppress and marginalize people. They're deliberately created to separate the other, right? And so I think that reform is not possible, because why would an institution reform itself and hold itself accountable when that is directly against their interests? So, you know, these, especially with, you know, policing and so-called criminal justice, these things were created to protect property and wealth, created to protect the elite. So in order for these systems to be reformed, they would basically have to dissolve themselves. They would have to directly, you know, enact and take actions against themselves, and they're not going to do it. There is no space for reform. I think we have to really be realistic and come to terms with ourselves that, like you said, so body cams, all these other reforms that have been enacted obviously are not stopping the violence against Black and Brown communities. They're just not. And so we we have to have that conversation with ourselves. When are we going to stop trying to fix something that obviously is fundamentally broken? You know, these systems are only taught to criminalize, not to help, not care, criminalization. You know, not caring for someone, disappearing that person as the problem. So we have to kind of focus our sights on that. You know, the same people that want to serve justice are the same people doing the violence. So we really need to have that conversation with ourselves to come to terms with the fact that reform basically is not possible.
I think also too, just financially, you know, reformation requires more money to be added into the budget for that. Abolition requires that money to be reallocated to communities that benefit from it the most. You know what I mean? So a lot of times when we're talking about reformation too, people oftentimes say increase training, increase this, increased police equipment and whatnot, so they can be readily surveilled by body cams. And, you know, marginalized communities are saying no, like, you don't need to be adding this extra money that we could be using for education, for health, for housing, you know, things that we really, really need. And there's just a large disconnect between individuals that are talking about reformation, having these discussions, and the marginalized communities that would benefit from it most. You know, abolition is kind of, we talk about defunding, you know, defunding and abolition in tandem with each other oftentimes, because when we're talking, you know, the first step is, I would say, in terms of that, is defunding, because the allocation of money needs to be redistributed. You know, we don't want that money that's being resulted in the abolition of these systems to be reintegrated into other systems. Let's say the abolition of VCUPD somehow being reinstituted in the carceral system. You know, we don't want those. We want those to be reallocated to communities that benefit and need those the most.
No, I definitely think, honestly, Stephen, thank you for that, because I think that point is so well put. Like what pretty much what you pointed out is perfect, because like you said, if we want to talk about money, we want to talk about funds, you know, every time, and even in our experience, you know, we can't do this because of money. We can't do this because we don't have the money for it. Well, you're overfunding police stations, you're overfunding police departments to the point where they're completely militarized. So like you said, abolition is putting the money into systems of care so that we can get to the root of crime. And reform means millions and billions of more dollars to police departments to continue to, you know, brutalize and commit violence against Black and Brown communities. So today on Student Power Radio, we are joined by Nick DaSilva. Nick is a VCU alum and an active community organizer in the city of Richmond and on VCU campus. Nick is also running for city council in the 5th district. Again, thank you so much, Nick, for coming on with us today. We're super excited about this chat. We just want to get started by asking you just a little bit about your work, about yourself, and how you got started in this work in regards to VCUPD.
Yeah, so I began, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. I'm glad to share the information I've kind of gathered. I began my research into the VCU Police Department in my sophomore, junior year at VCU. I was primarily motivated partially by what I had heard from my friends and people I knew at VCU, that VCU PD was constantly harassing them. They were always asking people for IDs, that sort of thing. And I'd seen, you know, that sort of behavior around campus. But then in May, after Marcus David Peters was killed by the Richmond police, I especially wanted to know what the policing system was like in my own institution and what those sort of mechanisms looked like at VCU. So I started spending a pretty considerable amount of my free time researching the VCU police based on their own reports. I would also attend VCU Board of Visitors meetings to try to understand what the goals of the university were in broad strokes and understand what the background was of what they were hoping to achieve, so that I could hopefully understand the mindset and what informed the policies and directions of the various VCU departments, including the VCU PD. And that included, I also had a chance to study it in a semi-academic setting when I was in my senior year at VCU. And so that's how it got started, and that's how my introduction to the topics was formed.
So with that, what would you say that the state of policing looks like at VCU, like gathering from your research and all of the work that you've done?
Yeah, so there's obviously there's the objective description provided by the VCU police on their website. They have 95 sworn officers, though it varies a little bit. They have 25 support staff. They have over 200 private security workers. They're one of the largest police department or university police departments in the state and certainly in the country. They have departments for investigations, patrols, emergencies, and other administration purposes. They have separate emergency communications from the Richmond Police, although they do coordinate with the Richmond Police pretty heavily with other kind of departments of VCU to kind of meet one of their goals, which is to, I'm quoting here from some of their writing, help make VCU and its surrounding community a safer place. So the VCU police have a jurisdiction that goes well into the surrounding communities outside the bounds of specifically university-owned property. And that obviously has grown over the last 20 years pretty considerably.
Right.
Yeah. And that's all information you can find online. But part of what I wanted to bring to the conversation is kind of, if we could talk for a moment about like what y'all see VCU policing as, like what is y'all's experience with VCU policing? Because I know that like you can describe it in kind of that like objective way, but I think it's more important to kind of like connect that in. So what do y'all think in terms of like, have y'all had experiences with the VCU police that you want to share? Is that something that, what have y'all seen?
I haven't personally had direct experiences, but I do know that there is this underground, like kind of, and we talked about in our last podcast, this subculture of what to do on campus if you see PD, or even precautions that you may take when walking on campus. I mean, I've been told by friends, do you have your ID? Like when leaving a friend's house, oh, I'm going to walk through campus home. Do you have your ID? Or I even know, and this is something that we even talked about in class, Nick, but people were saying that sometimes they deliberately wear backpacks on campus as to mark themselves as students. Any way that they can flag themselves as students, even as far as like, you know, backpacks or VCU shirts, things like that. That type of like subculture has definitely shown itself within, just from my experience on campus as a student. I don't know if you guys have.
I think personally, I've had a couple run-ins with VCUPD, like never in like the capacity of like perhaps getting like arrested, but like just very uncomfortable experiences. You know, like ID checks. Always having to wear a backpack as a person of color is definitely something that's kind of a must. And I think personally, like when it comes to like talking about how VCPD interplays with like the community, it's something that's like an omnipresent thing that everyone as a person of color knows. And I think it's also important to note like it affects kind of everyone differently. As a brown person, I have definitely have had more negative experiences than like my white counterparts. But I also know that like being a black student is a completely different experience. And I think there's like this conscious marginalization that happens from like our police department on campus. And I think the important thing to highlight is that these stories are very common. I think that's part of like the tone of policing on campus. It's like, it's an omnipresent thing that like is always in the back of your mind. Kind of highlights more of my experience. I also think that there's like an intimidation factor, especially being somebody now more recently than ever that speaks out against these things. It's like VCPD is everywhere, you know, outside of our residences, all of that stuff. I think it's really important to know that like VCPD, the overall tone of what they do is less of protecting us and more of like a surveillance type thing, it seems at least.
For me, mine was a little bit more direct. So I live in Carver, which is right near VCU campus. So technically VCUPD has, you know, jurisdiction down here. And so I wasn't sure who it was, call kind of like, I don't know if it was a noise complaint or whatnot to my house. So this was a little bit before I kind of fully understood my rights as well. But essentially the situation was I was with another individual that was white, and they were concerned about the well-being of the other individual just by the looks of it, considering that I'm a brown, relatively larger man. And so they had me, I came out of the house, obviously, because I, you know, didn't necessarily know my rights at the time. They like grilled me on the situation and kind of assumed that I had done something, I assumed that I was being relatively violent or aggressive when it was like 12 noon on like a Saturday. I was just like cleaning my house. It was kind of weird for me because like an hour later, I was just like making breakfast and like, relaxing and kind of having that experience. And so when I came out, they had essentially kind of detained me. They told me to sit on the ground outside my house and like told me to put my hands behind my back. It was two VCUPD officers that I see on campus still now all the time. And, they told me to sit in my alleyway right outside my house and were like kind of like berating me and kind of assuming that I was, the individual at fault, and they had like threatened to press charges. But the other individual I was with was not whatsoever attempting to press charges because that was not the situation that was going on. And so, yeah, it just, I don't know. It was like, I'm just trying to get on throughout my day, and it seems like I'm being like harassed, and also having to forcefully like sit, having to put my hands behind my back because I'm viewed as a threat, just because obviously like I am like a taller brown man. And so, yeah, and the other individual I was with was smaller, white man. And in that sort of way, like kind of demonizing me for just my existence was something that I faced. And that's not the first time. I've been like stopped multiple times on campus for walking late at night. I've been stopped while walking my dogs. I've felt like I've been followed home for walking my dogs. There was an instance the other night. It was a smaller group of us, about 5 or 6 of us, and we were outside just somebody's house. And this was on, I want to say this is on Main Street, so right outside like that 7-Eleven area. There was an older man, and he was driving in a wheelchair, and he seemed to potentially be having like a mental health crisis or just something he needed assistance in that sort of way. And so an officer had like followed him all the way down the street. So our group, we followed, like 5 or 6 of us, we followed to make sure that he was getting home safely. The officer actually ended up calling a backup, pursuing him on foot, following him, trying to move him and trying to get him off VCU campus, like directing his chair. But as soon as we started recording him, his behavior immediately changed. He got in his car. He acted like he wasn't doing anything. And we had let him know, we were like, yeah, we'll get him home. So we ended up walking this older, disabled gentleman home. But VCU PD followed us all the way to basically almost Idlewood. And this was about like a 20-minute walk. So they followed us on foot to Idlewood after multiple times us informing them that, we didn't feel safe. We didn't want their presence. And yeah, so we ended up getting him home. I just believe he was having sort of maybe not a mental health crisis. We just needed assistance, and he had let us know that this wasn't the first time this has happened. Like he said that this has happened multiple times, and he just didn't feel safe being, around PD at all. So it's made to believe that VCUPD, in my book, in my opinion, is this kind of like entity force that's here to protect students and the interests of students or the interests of the VC community. But at the same time, it's like they gentrify just as much as RPD does. They harass just as much as RPD does. They, commit violence just as much as RPD does. I don't really know anybody, honestly, that I've met that has had an encounter with VCUPD that can say it's a positive one.
And just one thing to add off, I think it's really important that you bring up like your experience the other day, because like even though it's hard for us to navigate our own personal experiences with VCPD, I know everybody has a story like this, and it's not just students who are being affected. I know a lot of times I try and help out like housing insecure people in my neighborhood. Oftentimes, like I think there's a real disconnect when I tell them I'm a VCU student, because they associate that with the harassment that they deal with on a consistent basis from the VCU Police Department. Because I think it's important to note that overtly, VCU's police department affects us as students, but covertly, the homeless population, the Native Richmond population, they deal with them at an exponentially higher rate, from what it seems like to me. But they deal with that harassment on a daily basis. It's the same thing that our Black and brown students at VCU face, but I think it's really important to highlight the impact in the greater VCU area as well on like non-students.
That's one of the key points actually that came up when I was doing research a couple of years back. But first of all, the fact that it is so common for people to have personal stories negatively associated with the VCUPD is backed up by all the statistics that are put out by the VCUPD. And part of what you mentioned, the fact that, there is that persecution, for lack of a better word, of homeless individuals, of VCU residents is well documented. Unfortunately, it's kind of hard to compile that information because VCU PD put out their crime reports by like 3-month periods. And so after that, they get cycled out, and you can go in person to the VCU Police Department on Broad Street, and they say they have an iPad there where you can search all the information, but that's not a readily accessible source. But back when I was doing an initial report for a class a couple of years back, what I found for the 3-month period where it had been reported is more often than not, residents were getting stopped. And if y'all want to talk a little bit about like the statistics, I have a whole lot of information from 2019 about the statistics of arrests and some of that, if y'all want to get into that.
Yeah, I think that would be great. We'd obviously love to hear about the disparities in arrest, because we know that's of course there. And what's the number one thing people get arrested for by VCUPD? We'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so like I said, we have data sets from previous 3-month cycles that I've collected, but unfortunately they don't necessarily remain online in an accessible way long term. So the information I'm sharing isn't based on yearly sets other than 2019. The information I'm sharing is based off of 3-month sets for specific crimes, and it's for the 2019 year for overall statistics, because that's the information that's put out by the VCUPD. That's what's most readily available. However, the picture that it paints does not paint the VCUPD in a necessarily positive light, because what we see is that by pretty much every approximation that they put out in terms of traffic stops, Black folks are overrepresented based on the census for the area in terms of how many Black folks live there. Certainly in terms of how many Black folks attend VCU, they're overrepresented in traffic stops by nearly 20%. In total arrests by nearly 20%. And I think for me, the most important aspect of this is in field interviews. And field interviews, that's a deceptive name, because essentially what it is a stop and frisk policy, kind of like what we've seen in New York and in different other places. The field interview process, or also known as informal police contacts, is very, very commonly used by the VCUPD. In 2019, there were about 1,643 field interviews that were recorded by the police. Of those interviews, over 55% of the people stopped, nearly 1,000 of those were Black people. And especially for the census tract, especially for VCU's own student population, that is an overrepresentation of far more than 23%. When we talk about the use of force incidents, and I'll get back to the field interviews later because I have a lot more to say about that as it regards to VCU policing. But the use of force incidents are the most jarring, I think, discrepancy, because for 2019, 85% of use of force incidents were against Black folks. 85%. And that is by VCU Police's own reporting. And so, unfortunately, like I said, it's hard to collect massive amounts of data on specific crimes. But for the data that I've collected in past 3-month cycles, what I've noticed is consistently we see charges, and they break them up by Monroe Park campus and the MCV campus, the medical campus. And so you get 2 data sets. It's the same police force, but they separate them because of geographic area. I don't think it's the best way to collect it, but that's neither here nor there. What we see on Monroe Park campus, less so on MCV campus, what we see on Monroe Park campus is that overwhelmingly, you'll have reports of car thefts or, like thefts from a dorm or stuff like that. A lot of, they show like pending cases that have been closed for lack of evidence, this, that, and the other. And so you have a lot of information. They also post the RPD reports, but they mark those specifically. The crime that most often I've seen people most commonly get picked up for or arrested on Monroe Park campus is either trespassing or narcotics. And when I refer to narcotics, it's almost always marijuana violations. And trespassing is an especially common charge. It comes up you would be hard pressed to go through a monthly cycle without finding a trespassing charge against someone, almost always a non-VCU student, a resident of the city. And so that there are a lot of discrepancies, but what we see is the VCU police do have a tendency to over-police by a pretty wide margin the Black residents of the city.
And I think that really highlights how there's a tone set out by the administration. I believe the term they use is that they seamlessly have integrated Monroe Park campus with the greater Richmond community. But you see that's not true when Native Richmond residents are consistently being demonized for, one, being on campus, as well as also just being in the vicinity. So I think that's like really important to note. And like I know personally, like I've noticed a lot of Native Richmond residents who don't go to VCU that are my friends. They highlight that they feel unsafe on a campus that preaches and promotes safety. One of the biggest metrics that the university uses to say we have this promotion of safety is their VCU police department, which is like actively demonizing those very people who they say they protect.
As we talked about before, the fact that a lot of students, especially Black students at VCU, have a personal experience being harassed by the VCU police, or there is that subculture of always making sure you have your ID, conspicuously looking like what a student looks like. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when I talk about field interviews later, because that is a very key part of this conversation. That is an indicator, along with these statistics, that this is happening consistently and systematically, that the VCU police are consciously going out of their way to look for people that they feel like don't belong or are not students, and they are profiling them for, traffic stops, for ID checks, this, that, and the other.
And we keep touching on VCU students too, but I also want to directly ask, how does VCUPD interact with the community? Because I know we talked about gentrification and VCUPD extending its reach in other parts of the community, and kind of in tandem with that, how has VCU used VCUPD as a tool to be violent towards the community and community members?
Yeah, so this is something that I've found. The answer to this varies wildly depending on who you ask. Obviously, the same can be said of pretty much any type of policing, but especially for VCUPD. The VCU police, they send liaisons to community meetings, neighborhood associations. They try to promote cooperation between community groups and the VCU police. However, in the immediate area surrounding the VCU campus, specifically the Monroe Park campus, more often than not, the interactions end up being more violent, whether that is physically violent, use of force, or systematically violent, or intimidation, whatever you want to classify that violence as. As we talked about before, the VCUPD commonly arrests people for trespassing, which can have compounding kind of criminal charges, especially if you have been arrested before, or if you've been arrested for trespassing before, or if the VCUPD think that you're not supposed to be there, because that is an aspect in the legal code of trespassing. And unfortunately, that means that if an area is identified either legally, as in it's owned by VCU, or it's legally leased by VCU, anything like that, or it's culturally considered to be VCU property. I say culturally because there are areas like Monroe Park, which are not legally necessarily owned by VCU, but they are kind of culturally considered to be part of that area through that public-private partnership. It usually ends up meaning that the VCUPD, they commit to the removal of, quote, unwanted individuals. And we get an idea of what VCU police officers are looking for when we look at the process of the field interviews, which I mentioned before, which, as I said, are a policy of stop and frisk. As I said before, 1,643 field interviews in 2019, of which nearly 1,000 were Black individuals. we can understand why that overrepresentation happens when we reference the VCU police policies for quote, justification for conducting a field interview. And this can be found on the VCU website. I have it in front of me right now. You can be found on the VCU police website behind a VCU login wall. You have to log in through an institutional account to access it. And I'm just going to read some of the qualities that they say are acceptable reasons for beginning a field interview. You'll see immediately why this becomes extremely problematic. So starting from the top, some of the reasons that justify field interview are the appearance or demeanor of an individual that suggests he or she is part of a criminal enterprise or engaged in a criminal act. Number 2, the actions of the subject suggest that he or she is engaged in criminal activity. Number 3, the hour of the day or night is inappropriate for the subject's presence in the area. Number 4, the subject's presence in a neighborhood or location is inappropriate.
Wow.
Yeah, I'm just going to full stop there. There are 4 more justifications, but the fact that the VCUPD and their official policies say that a reason for stopping someone under the stop and frisk policy is the subject's presence in a neighborhood or location is inappropriate. And as some of the other qualities that they listed were, they appear to be engaging in a criminal act, or they look like they could be criminal. And obviously those are extremely, extremely racialized terms, especially in the former capital of the Confederacy, especially in the environment we live in. And so when we understand that those are the qualities that they're looking for, and that they commit these field interviews, the stop and frisk stops constantly, we understand why there is that overrepresentation, because they're actively looking for reasons to stop people. And if someone, they can decide on a whim that someone looks inappropriate for the area. And that can help you understand why that subculture is developed, why there's a subculture of having to almost like dress up as a student, or what the proper student, I put proper in quotation marks, what the proper student looks like, because the VCU police, by their own policies, are looking for people who are not appropriate to the area.
Right. I know, just speaking on my part and in my experience, I had no idea these things even existed. I know that when I went through orientation, I think, and I know you guys fact check me on this, but VCUPD gives a presentation.
They do, yeah.
Right.
They do.
And mostly it's for parents, because I know my parents went, and I don't remember hearing about any of this stuff, like in terms of someone whose presence is inappropriate. And I know, especially for me as a person of color, and for my parents as well, that would have been a red flag immediately.
Yeah, they're just basically, Nick, what you just read, to me, and if we're calling a spade, it's like, that's basically just saying that like you can institute a stop and frisk policy for Black and brown people. That's really what that is.
Right.
I think it's also important to notice that it's a deliberate use of vague lexicon.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what the word is. Diction, perhaps.
Right.
Like that's intentional. It's meant that way. So DC police have that protection to basically over-police Black and brown people within the greater Richmond community and on campus.
Right, because then we know too, in the makeup of the neighborhoods that surround VCU, specifically the Fan, I mean, you have Grove that runs right into campus. It ends actually near the library. And in these neighborhoods specifically are overly made up of either A, students, or B, families that can afford to live there, mostly white people. So, and
then in Jackson Ward,
right,
and Carver, there's the increased police presence because perhaps they have more Black and brown people that live in there. That's why the Fan, it's like, yeah, those are residential homes for family. You don't see as much VCPD every day parked outside of those houses,
running their lights.
Oregon Hill, in particular areas of Oregon Hill, you don't have that police presence, at least from what I've seen.
Right.
Yeah. So the last thing I wanted to mention in terms of how VCU PD interact with the community and what their position is, how VCU has used the VCU police. So part of what I mentioned earlier is that I went to a lot of Board of Visitors meetings. And like I said, those were to understand the justifications, the goals, why the different departments of VCU were acting the way they were. And the notes, I referred back to my notes from one of these meetings back in the December of 2018. And part of the master plan for VCU, part of it is Quest 2025, part of it is One VCU. It's collectively known as the VCU master plan. That was being approved back then, or is in the process of being approved. And part of what was critical for that is a process they refer to as placemaking. And this has a couple of definitions from different people, but the way they use it, the Board of Visitors specifically uses it, and the way the VCU administration uses it is to define it as making the parts of campus that are VCU, the sections of the city which they define as VCU, as being very visibly VCU. You can differentiate between VCU and the surrounding community. And so part of this for the master plan was how they want to develop down Broad Street and how they connect the two campuses, the medical campus and the Monroe Park campus. And part of that is they defined the VCU Police Department as a, quote, critical anchor between those two campuses. VCU has consistently demonstrated that they want to use the VCU Police not just as a building or an institution, but as a organization to define, specifically through placemaking, define what is VCU and what isn't. And as we've seen, as I just talked about in terms of their stop and frisk policy, they are looking for people who don't belong in VCU. So not only do they want to expand and show what is not VCU and what is, but they want to restrict who is allowed in that space. And of course, when it comes to policing, especially in the South, but basically anywhere in the whole world, policing is racialized. That means that the VCU police are being used as a tool to directly keep people who don't belong on VCU out, and indirectly to kind of enforce this segregation of, you know, who is a good student and who isn't, that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. The placemaking, even when we had that, when you first came and did this presentation in class, the placemaking thing is always something that stood out to me, just because it just seems so obviously so inappropriate. And I feel like as an administrator, even as BOV, you know, these people are well educated, you know, have these professionals experiences. And I feel like that's an obvious, okay, well, this is not, like, we should not be doing this. So I think too, in terms of that, just kind of talking about also how VCUPD and RPD are connected, and how they may work together to ensure that this goal or this master plan is met, if at all.
Yeah, and so the VCU and RPD are, first of all, the two departments have a memorandum of understanding. This document defers to the Richmond Police or the VCU Police in investigations depending on the circumstances of the crime, the severity of the crime, the type of crime, the origin of the call, the location of it, a lot of different factors. There is obviously close communication between the RPD and the VCUPD, but also you have a lot of Richmond police officers end up in the VCU Police Department, especially after they've had long careers in the Richmond Police. The former chief, John Venuti, who's now the vice president for public safety for VCU, he worked for the Richmond Police for decades before becoming the VCU Police Department chief. Culturally and logistically, they're very closely tied. But also the chief of the VCU Police reports to Meredith Weiss, who's the vice president of administration, who reports to Carol Kane Gray, who's the senior vice president and chief financial officer, who obviously reports to President Michael Rao, the head of the university. So you do have VCU ultimately has control over the police department financially and command-wise. But you also have the jurisdiction expansion, which we saw a couple of years back. Back when that was happening, we saw that the VCUPD were trying to expand their jurisdiction by several square city blocks. It was a pretty substantial increase. It would give them jurisdiction over a lot of the space in between the two campuses, basically all the way down Broad Street, large swaths of area in Richmond and downtown Richmond. And what we saw because of that is there's a lot more overlap between what the VCU police does and the RPD does. And obviously they distinguish because of the memorandum of understanding, but they do have overlapping jurisdictions in a lot of places. Part of what that does, and obviously back when the jurisdiction was expanding, I was there. I went to city council when it happened. It was a vote at city council, and dozens and dozens of students showed up to ask that they not expand the VCU police jurisdiction. We had seen firsthand what this police department had done to our fellow students, to residents of the community in the existing jurisdiction. Unfortunately, the city council at the time did not recognize that or recognize those student voices as valid participants because they hadn't seen them before, because they didn't recognize them as residents. And so that vote went through and they expanded the jurisdiction. So now there is a lot of cooperation between the VCUPD and the Richmond Police.
I think just before we get into some abolition stuff, do you have anything else that you want to note, I guess, or go deeper into?
Yeah, I mean, all I would say is that I wish this information were more clearly available. The information I've been sharing from the Board of Visitors and from the VCUPD, I've been able to get myself from attending the Board of Visitors meetings and taking those notes myself, or logging in with my institutional access to find the policies of the VCUPD. But unfortunately, there's such a lack of transparency, even more so than the Richmond Police, that it's very hard to access. And then the last thing I wanted to point out is there is a significant issue in the VCUPD of the fact that it is overwhelmingly white, is overwhelmingly male staffed, especially among sworn officers. And so there is, on top of the VCU and the institutional, the policy incentives to commit these racialized acts of violence through policing, there is also that racial disparity that means that there's not a real representative body in any form through the VCUPD. And so unfortunately, that leads to a lot of the over-policing that we have seen.
And just one more question directly from me too. We've heard it talked about a few times too, but maybe you could talk a little bit more to sort of VCUPD be kind of stepping stone towards RPD and kind of that promotional sort of support they have between two, because I think a lot of times VCU students kind of think of, well, I know a lot of VCU students that think of VCUPD as kind of a distinct, lesser, less violent force than RPD just because it's surrounded around a university. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing I would say to that is they are, by all measurements, just as much of a police force as the RPD. They carry lethal weapons. They carry guns. They are certified police officers in the eyes of the law. They can give you traffic tickets. They can stop and frisk you. They can do anything that a police officer can. And the only difference is we have less control and less accountability over them than we do the Richmond Police. And they work at the behest of a university that is directed by a Board of Visitors. And that Board of Visitors is appointed by the governor. And if you look at those people, they're consistently the CEOs or former CEOs of large companies. So these are not, to trickle it on down, the VCU Police Department is not guided by an elected official like the mayor or the chief administrative officer, someone who may have some accountability to the city. It is controlled by someone who is appointed by a board that is appointed by the governor. And then the president who is appointed gives the power to another person who gives the power to another person who controls the VCU police, who have their own chief. So it's several layers removed from actual accountability. And so I would say that to anyone who thinks it is a lesser or police light, I would say that you really have to interrogate like what they do. And just because they have that VCU police name does not mean they're not RPD officers, former or future. It does not mean that they don't closely associate with the RPD. So that's what I really have to say about that.
Yeah, and going off of that, like having these discussions, I know a lot of us have been talking about things like defunding the VCUPD, and in particular for us, the abolition of VCUPD as an entity as a whole. So if you could talk about maybe what abolition means to you, that'd be like greatly appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really big question, but I'll do my best to keep it short. Abolition to me is a framework that allows us to approach policing, incarceration policy, quote unquote, criminal justice from the perspective of wanting to eliminate the residual and current institutions and create something entirely different that is reflective of policies and processes that help and try to actually rehabilitate or help, or whatever word you want to use, actually help people instead of punishing them for the so-called crimes they've committed, and seeks to actually treat the issues people are dealing with rather than just throw them in a cage, essentially. Obviously, I'm running for city council in the 5th district. And so I have a abolitionist policy perspective, but I also have as a community organizer, I have a perspective of how do we abolish the cultural institutions such as white supremacy that are the reasons that these carceral institutions are so bad. So to kind of bring that back down to earth a little bit more, for me, policy-wise, what does that look like in Richmond? I think it looks like using tools such as defundment, using city policy and the budget to begin the process of abolition. When we talk about abolition, obviously we're not just talking about getting rid of something old, but we're also talking about creating something new, something that does not exist yet, that we might not even necessarily have the full shape of, because we've been raised in a society that values punishment and incarceration as the solution to our problems. So some of the policies, like I said, defunding the police, but also removing the ordinances and policies which criminalize survival, which criminalize houselessness, which criminalize sex work, which criminalize different street economies that, like the war on drugs, that led to mass incarceration. That looks like what do we put in the place of the police? What do we have instead is what people usually ask. And to that, I would say you don't necessarily need to replace the police with something. You need to get rid of the kind of current institutions of policing we have and look at the problems holistically and find out what we can do instead. So we're not looking at like, we're going to replace the police with different police. We're going to replace the police with a Department of Social Health, different institutions which can actually fill in those gaps, institutions which give people housing. Really good example of, I think, what the abolitionist framework looks like practically. I saw there was a houseless individual on Broad Street who didn't have shoes, and a VCU police officer, or I believe it was a VCU police officer, gave her a ticket instead of, I don't know, simply buying shoes for her. And so like it's a small example, but it's a very good example of what we talk about with abolition, of needing to actually create solutions to these problems instead of just ticketing them out of existence, like washing people out of our society. in broad strokes, that's what abolition looks like for me. I can talk about it in terms of like different, like prison abolition or abolition of police, how we go about defunding the police, what that looks like, but that's kind of the broad strokes for me.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. We had a question about budgeting specifically for VCPD. I think that would tie into when we're looking at defunding VCPD. I think it's important to understand how the budgeting works around VCPD. So we just had a question about like what it looks like, because when we try to look it up, the information is not really visible there for us to easily access it. Because we know with RPD, we can look into the budgeting for that. But when it comes to VCPD, it's just really hard to find that information.
I truly wish I had better news for you, but unfortunately, I think that's something that's going to have to be either Freedom of Information Act requested from the university, if not kind of formally pursued, because I have spent 2 or 3 years now trying to find that same information. I have had, I assume, just as much as luck as y'all have, because it is, the budget for VCU is intentionally not transparent. It's meant to be used by the administration to, balance a budget and kind of make the university workable and profitable. And so that is not information that I think is readily available in any form. Unfortunately, I do think that's something that I've been talking with other VCU activists about this. I think that's something that is going to have to be Freedom of Information Act requested. But I do know that as it stands, it is the chief of police is in charge of budgeting on the departmental level. And obviously the senior vice president and chief financial officer, Carol Kane Gray, it would be a good place to start with that because she is in charge of the finances for the whole university.
Okay, thank you. And when we're looking into abolishing VCUPD, I think you touched bases on creating new, like communities of care. So what would that look like? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think that if we're talking about the VCU police specifically, we have to look at what the origin of campus policing is to answer like what would be a better system. I mean, right now, we discussed in depth what the VCU police actually serves to do, what they quite literally, descriptively, statistically do in Richmond. But if you go back historically, in the 60s and 70s, campus police were being phased in because of specifically because of the activist leanings of a lot of students and the, pretty notorious, we had, the Kent State shooting. You had incidents which made a lot of college administrators realize that they had to start controlling, I put that in big air quotes, controlling the student population that lives there because they were starting to realize their power. And students have a lot of power financially. And as like the largest group at most universities, they have a lot of power and say over what the university can do if they're organized. And so we start to see the rise of campus policing. Getting rid of that, I don't think necessarily makes the university an inherently less safe place, because I don't truly think, in my professional opinion, that the VCU police are making VCU substantially safer. And that can also be seen in the fact that a lot of sexual assault cases are not pursued properly, if at all, at VCU. That's not an issue unique to VCU or even to campus policing, though it is overwhelmingly represented. That is an issue that is inherent in a lot of policing systems. So what I think that the direction we should be going is, what are the actual issues of student safety? Students are dealing with sexual assault in incredibly high numbers. How do we create a system that actually serves those individuals? Some students don't feel safe in an urban environment. Well, okay. How do we teach those students to not be afraid of a, quote, urban environment? How do we teach them to get rid of that internalized racism that they have towards this city and towards living in a majority Black city? Because that is a very real, quote unquote, issue that a lot of students deal with. They are dealing with that internalized racism. So how do we educate students? How do we give them the cultural competence to exist in the place that they live? And I think by looking at paths like that, I think that you will start to see that those issues are not issues that need to be solved by arresting all the houseless people on campus. They're not issues that need to be solved by segregating a community and keeping all the people who don't belong out. In terms of creating communities of care, I think that's something where I don't think it can be done by the university and the student population alone, though I have no doubt that is very possible to start that process. I think that the university does not exist in a vacuum. And so when we talk about creating communities of care, when we talk about creating networks for mutual aid, when we talk about providing people for the needs they have, we have to look to the larger city. And so obviously we have a very high poverty rate in Richmond that is not necessarily reflected one-to-one in the students that move to VCU. So there are different problem sets, with VCU being the university that has the highest rate of students staying where they move to go to college after they graduate. I think it's somewhere up around 42%. VCU students do have or should have a reason to be very invested in their community. And so I think, working with other activists in the city, people have been doing this for decades longer than may have even been in the city, is very necessary for that. So I hope that kind of answers the question. To kind of sum it up, I don't believe the current functions of campus policing are for student safety. I think they are more for the benefit of the university at large as an institution.
And I think kind of for our last question towards you. So the intention for this podcast is especially to bridge the gap between community members, students at VCU, youth, maybe people that aren't here, is to kind of facilitate a general understanding of the situation from multiple different perspectives. I just wanted to ask you, what is the importance of keeping students, VCU students especially, engaged with what's going on in the community?
So like I just mentioned, we have such a high rate of students staying when they graduate. VCU advertises itself as a college or university that is very seamlessly integrated into the surrounding urban community, which is not necessarily true. But more so than quite a few other Virginia colleges, I do think we are placed very centrally in Richmond. And so what VCU does, what students do, what the administration does, directly impacts our community. VCU is the largest employer in all of Richmond. There's stuff to interrogate about that. Why do we have such a high poverty rate if this is our largest employing institution? There's a lot of reasons why VCU students should consider Richmond their community. But beyond that, VCU has access to tremendous resources in terms of resources, money, political capital. VCU is a very strong, powerful institution. And so we as students, realizing that we have power over that institution to an extent, should then realize that we need to be using those resources. We need to be redistributing those resources in a way that is responsible to our community. So it's been my goal when I was at VCU, when I graduated, running for office, it has always been my goal to try to get more students involved in the community, because once you realize that the same issues that VCU students care about, not having access to the bus systems, paying too much for tuition, not having access to housing, not having access to healthy food, these are issues that may be experiencing this microcosm of VCU, they're experienced tenfold all over Richmond. And those issues are not going to go away when you graduate. And so it's better that we, as an institution which has some privilege and has some power, I think we need to start using our power to start giving back to the community we live in. So, yeah.
One more thing, just kind of in tandem with that too. I know kind of a lot of people are seeing, the situation with protesters and kind of stuff that's ongoing at VCU and whatnot, and in the greater, larger Richmond community. But, these are affecting marginalized groups such as like Black, Brown, Indigenous, disabled, housing insecure, queer students. What would you say to students who maybe think that that these issues don't affect them, or why should I get involved if they don't affect me?
I would say that, first of all, if you're at a university, you've likely come here to learn. And I, as a political science student, learned far more from my community and the political struggle I engaged in with my neighbors than I could have ever learned in any class that I took at VCU. And the same will almost certainly can be said about any field, because VCU is an institution and Richmond is a place. Secondly, I would say that other people have said it far better than me. Not one single one of us can be free until all of us are free. And especially coming from positions of having, I won't say more free time, because not every single student has the same privilege, but coming from a position of going somewhere to learn, of having the ability to go to college and to spend part of your life and your savings in learning, you should also dedicate yourself to learning about the place you live in. And part of that is putting your own personal beliefs and preconceptions aside and looking at the real world around you. And that is Richmond. Richmond is in the process of one of the greatest political struggles the whole nation is, really, but Richmond specifically is in the process of one of the largest political struggles it's seen in decades. Richmond is a very unique city. It has a very fraught history, but within that, we have the ability to create something, I think, truly great, and the potential is there. But that does mean that we have to actually learn from the people who have been doing this for decades. So I would say to any student that's just coming to VCU or just coming to Richmond, any student that may not necessarily have been that involved in their community before, just take some time to listen to the people who have been talking about this. And trust me, you will learn a lot.
Right. And I'm so glad that you brought that up, because part of the things that we've been trying to work on recently, especially with VCU creating a class around community activism and protesting in Richmond, which obviously has since been taking off the course list. But it was especially frustrating because, one, it co-ops narratives, but also at the same time, the number, I guess, in my experience, number one way to learn what's going on and who you should be learning from are community members, community activists that have been doing this, like you said, for years, even decades. So for them to create a class centered around protest or protest and pandemic or whatever it was is super, it's like a slap in the face almost, because that's not necessarily a discussion that should be facilitated by VCU. And it's not centering the voices of those that are most affected at all. So definitely, I want to reemphasize that sentiment that if you want to learn more, even like you can learn so much more being out there, listening to folks, listening to community members, and even searching for organizations that you can even get involved in. I mean, for us here, the communities of care that we're seeking are being implemented by community members. Mutual aid, bail fund. These things are what community members have put together that our government or even VCU has not even done or is unwilling to do. So I think that these are the places that we can definitely learn a lot from the community. And so that when we go forward in our lives, just like I'm poli-sci as well, that I can learn so much from these members in going forward in a political career, whatever that may be, or even working in policy. So yeah, I definitely, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because it's super important, and it's super important also to center the voices of those most affected. And I think VCU students definitely need to get more involved. It's pretty much at this point, it's life or death, honestly, for many people. So we can't really afford to sit around and be like, well, I go to VCU, it doesn't really matter. No, like we can't afford to do that anymore.
Like, honestly, just even going down to just like a basic advice that I would give to any college student is learn from your elders. And especially here in VCU, here in Richmond, but at VCU, there's this tendency to kind of repeat the past. And VCU administration relies on that heavily. There are 4-year segments where you have large spikes of activist activity, and you'll see demands being placed by students and organizing happening. And then a certain segment or group will graduate out and it'll die down again. And so you saw during the Occupy movement, I've talked to people who were here at VCU during the Occupy movement. You talk to people who were here in the last, 4 to 8 years, and they see the same things over and over again. They see the protests, they see the sit-ins at the president's office, they see, VCU trying to mitigate the consequences, and then it's kind of rinse and repeat. And so I think that by grounding yourself in the community around you, you can have that institutional knowledge and know what has happened before, so that you aren't doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past, and you can effectively change the environment around you.
I just think it's really important for us, like when we're talking about like the history of student activism, keeping that going, because like what you're saying, Nick, about the 4-year waiting periods, it's really important to note that that's kind of the way in which the administration kind of seeks to not listen to us. They'll wait us out. And I think creating those communities of care kind of eliminates that. We're here to say, regardless of when us at Student Power are gone, there's going to be a new Student Power. And like being able to help centralize those issues that we've been going through, making sure that the next generation doesn't have to deal with them and they can focus and tackle on their own issues, I think is really important, because I think there's like a bureaucrat-centric process that our institutions will adopt, which kind of say that they can kind of just wait us out. So I think it's really important for us to make sure we know that history, and like we're saying, don't be doomed to repeat it. But I think when it comes to organizing, like talking to potential organizers, I think a lot about Marcus, and like he was a VCU student, and that's one of our peers too, and it's like I don't want anyone to have to face that, what happened to him, ever again. So it's like making sure that we take care of our community members, both in the Richmond community and at VCU, like, so stuff like that doesn't have to happen. Like it's unacceptable. So keeping that in mind is just something very important.
Well, I just want to say once again, Nick, thank you so much for like having this conversation with us and being willing to share like your work and what you've done over the years, because I don't think the words can't describe how impactful this will be for students, because I can guarantee like most of the student body does not know any of this stuff. And like you said, it's not readily available. So it is so important that we continue to have these conversations. But I guess I can't even express the sentiment, how grateful we are that you came on today.
Yeah, of course. I'm glad to help. And I'm going to be trying to compile some of this information in a way that I hopefully when I was talking about it, it flowed a little bit logically, like understanding the cause and effect of how an idea from the Board of Visitors goes down to the VCUPD level. But I am going to be trying to put out either a video or some sort of shortened thing so that that information can be readily available. Yes.
I think that would be perfect. Yeah, because I think like even maybe like a graphic flow, just how all these things. Yeah, no, that'd be really cool. Definitely. Obviously, we're always here for whatever you need. So definitely keep us posted. You have my number. You have our DMs.
Mm-hmm.
We're here to support.
Yeah, we're
for
super
sure.
thankful. Like, yeah, I think for me at least, it's like obviously I'm like a statistic driven person, so hearing this like really is impactful. Yeah, I think it's super important that like our constituency understands the impact of police, because it's easy to hear us talk about like buzzwords, abolition of police, but knowing like statistics driven that show like the systematic issue is really important for everyone to know.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, by the way.
Thank y'all for having me on.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Student Power Radio. Remember, always plant the seeds to your radical garden.